everyone. Welcome back to the She Gallery Show. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Dulce Maria Diaz. I am founder and director of nonprofit Sharing His Energy Gallery, that is She Gallery. And today we are back with a very special guest, B-Boy B. Thank you for returning, B-Boy B.
Thank you for having me again. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. And we are again celebrating the evolution, the movement of graffiti history here in Chicago. We have of the earliest, if not the earliest, innovating graffiti writer of Chicago that helped develop the graffiti style of our city. And we did have a chance to talk with B-Boy B, and we started kind of like discussing a little bit about his history, how he came from Mexico, his introduction to graffiti, and now we are going to circle back and continue the story of his childhood friend, Fidel. Now, you may remember Fidel and B-Boy B, who was just Berto when he was Fidel's friend as a child at 6, 7 years old. And they started out writing, went on their separate ways, and then reconnected. B-Boy B, thank you for returning. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your story with Fidel and your
Sure.
development in the Chicago graffiti history?
Yes. Um, I lived way on the north side when I was a little kid, like 7, 8 year old, and I had a friend there who lived in the same building on a different floor. His name was Fidel, and we used to, get together in the hallway and we used to draw together, just cartoons and stuff. And then I left. I went to Logan Square, with my family, and I never saw Fidel again until one day, well after ABC was established, we were having a graffiti war with a crew called ACW, All City Riders. And I was in the back of the bus and I saw this kid kind of in front of me, a few chairs up, and I saw him tag fast ACW. And he turned around to look to see who was watching him. And I saw him. And I'm like, hey, man, I know you. You're Fidel. And he's like, oh, Berto, what's up? So we got out, we kind of like, greeted each other. And then I, uh, I asked him, I said, you're Fast? That was his name in ACW, Fast. And, Fidel. And then his nickname started with an F, so Fast. And I didn't know, I knew Fast. I've seen his tags around, but I didn't know it was him. And then I'm like, yeah. He's like, wait, what do you know? What do you know about graffiti? I'm like, you're not gonna believe this, but I'm B-Boy B of ABC, and we're at war right now, you and me. So that was the long, like I hadn't seen him in like 10 years. And then when I finally saw him, we reconnected. And the weird thing is that we went to separate neighborhoods, but we took the same path of graffiti. And then we met up again when we were at war with each other. And then we had a laugh, because back then the city was so infested with gangs and gang violence that literally hip hop and all of its elements represented an outlet for nonviolence. That was, in the 80s and early 80s, you did graffiti, you battled in breaking, you battled rapping, and you battled in mixing and DJing and scratching. All of those were nonviolent acts because Chicago was so violent in the 80s. So, we had a laugh, even though we were at war, but it wasn't like a physical war. I just told them, when you get off the bus, I'm just going to scratch your name on it, put my name up. And we were laughing. So that's how I reconnected with a childhood friend. So that's the story. It's complete now.
That's so funny. And so
Yeah.
we're talking about, two children, very innocent children that we can all connect to, right? And ACW, as he's mentioning, All City Writers Crew. So they're two opposing crews. And when we say opposing crews, it's not like opposing gangbangers, as he's saying. This is an outlet, a way to have healthy competitions. It's the,
Yes.
it's just a very healthy competition. As he mentioned, B-Boy B was part of four crews. Ultimately, has been part of four crews. And these crews, that's what they do, is they organize permission walls or other events or things. And now as we get older, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, B-Boy B also started curating his own shows to cultivate all of this history. And you know, we talk about graffiti and we talk about hip hop and we talk about a lot of these elements. And B-Boy B, we're just having a conversation about his name, B-Boy B, how nowadays everybody refers to them, everybody that breakdances refers to themselves as a B-Boy. But you were the first to use your name as an identifier for your craft. Would you like to talk to us a little bit more about your name and your position with breakdancing and in the Logan
Yeah,
Square neighborhood?
yeah. So Logan Square in the 80s, I guess, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and in the 90s started changing. But in those early times, it was 100% Puerto Rican neighborhood. A few people were black and a few people were white. And then I was right in the middle, and I was the only Mexican in the Puerto Rican neighborhood. So what ended up happening is that Puerto Ricans are attached to New York via Puerto Rico. So you go to Puerto Rico, you go to New York, and then you spread out to Connecticut, Chicago, whatever. So that trail leads East Coast styles and East Coast happenings and trends to Chicago. So it comes from New York to Chicago because of the culture was Puerto Rican. If it had been the other way around and I lived in a Mexican neighborhood, maybe I would get influenced by California, Mexicans coming from California to Chicago. But in Logan Square, it was the opposite. It was coming from New York. And that's how I got introduced to breakdancing. I had a friend of mine who lived in the neighborhood. His cousin would come every summer because, they get rid of the kids. They send them to the mom's house or the dad's house. And this kid's cousin, I don't remember his name, but he brought with him from New York, because everybody in New York was doing it already, a form of dance that I had never seen before.
Yeah.
And we were hanging out outside, and he did what everybody calls a moonwalk, but it's technically called the slide. So he did a slide moonwalk backwards on the sidewalk, and I was like, "Oh my God, what in the world are you doing?" And it was eye-opening to me because I wanted to learn how to do what he did. And then he showed us some little things and showed us how to. Actually, he didn't show us. We were forced to like mimic because he didn't want to. He was very New York. He was like, "I'm going to show you." But we mimicked him, and he did it. He did his dancing. He was doing a little like some popping. So we kind of mimicked, and he left. He left after a couple of weeks, and we continued to try and figure that out. So that's how I got introduced to b-boying, to breakdancing. And later on, a couple of years later, movies started coming out like Flashdance, and other movies that had little clips of breakers. And then the big breaking movies came out. Wild Style came out, and Style Wars, and those brought that whole culture to Chicago, and that's how I got introduced to the dance part of hip hop. So I was first introduced to the dance part. The first element that I learned was the dance part, the dance element, and then I got into graffiti like a year later. So for me, my personal introduction to hip hop was the dance, was the b-boy movement. So that's why I call myself b-boy. And what ended up happening is that everybody in the neighborhood would have nicknames, but their nicknames would be very close to the real names. So if my real name is Berto, I chose to have a nickname with the letter B. So that's how I came up with b-boy B. So then I was later on, a few years later, like 7-8 years later, I met Crazy Legs. My friend Breaker Ray brought him to Chicago to to host and to judge the battles that we were throwing around the town, around Chicago. And
Okay,
he
sorry.
brought, yeah, get fine.
I'm gonna interrupt you for a second. So
That's
let's
fine.
back up a little bit. So we got your
Yes.
introduction, which we were also introduced at last segment, which is really interesting, right? Like for somebody that's
Yeah.
never seen this before, it's like, oh, the first
Right.
time moonwalk. So that's your influence. And then you started your own movement in the Logan Square area in your neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Crazy Legs. Can you please talk to us about who Crazy Legs is for the viewers that don't know,
Sure.
and then how you started organizing these competitions, these battles competitions in the Logan Square Eagle
Yes. So
platform?
when we were kids, when we first started this, we would congregate naturally at this place called the Eagle, which is on Milwaukee Avenue, uh, Kedzie, and Wrightwood. And it's a circular thing, and in the middle there's a square, and in the middle of the square is a giant 150-foot column with an eagle on the top. So we just call it the Eagle. It's called Centennial Monument. But who wants to call it? Let's go to the Centennial Monument. So we would call it the Eagle, and we like, let's go to the Eagle. And we would hang out at the Eagle. They had benches, they had steps. We would ride our bikes there. We would do tricks on our bikes, and we would write in our piece books. So on top of that, we were breakdancing at the Eagle on concrete. And other crews started congregating there, especially this crew called the West Side Rockers. And the West Side Rockers were one of the best breakdancing crews in Chicago because 5 out of 6 of them were from New York. So they came with that breakdancing thing, right? So they already were a mile ahead of us from Chicago because they already had the moves. So we would break at the Eagle, and then the West Side Rockers would come and then smoke us. But we would watch and learn and bite their style. So
Bite
that's
means
where,
mimic.
yeah, we would steal their moves basically. So that's how we started doing our own thing, and then that brought us to making our own events, because when we would go out to clubs, or even, they call them juice clubs, like Janelle's was a nightclub for 21 and under up to like the age of 13. So they couldn't sell drinks there, but they could sell, whatever, Kool-Aid or whatever, pop. But it was still had that same atmosphere of an adult nightclub, but for teenagers. So Janelle's was on Fullerton and Pulaski, and we would go there literally every week, and we would battle on the dance floor, and we would battle with, like, we would wear graffiti jackets, and we would all like stare at each other's jackets and who had the best jackets. So outside of that, Janelle's, who allowed us, his name was Al, allowed us to break dance, kind of. We would just kind of take over the floor. We wouldn't have any other places to go. So we started curating our own spots for battles. One of the spots was at the Eagle. On Sundays, we would have battles there. And the other ones, as we grew up, we would rent spaces and have battles, graffiti battles, breakdance battles. That led to, like, Breaker Ray and I to like bring, like, for the first time, we would go to New York every year to the Rocksteady crew reunions. And then we brought Crazy Legs in. Breaker Ray brought Crazy Legs in. Crazy Legs stayed at Breaker Ray's house because we couldn't afford a hotel. But he judged one of our battles, and I introduced myself to him when I met him, and I said,
And
"Hey, man, I'm B-Boy B."
B-Boy, who is Crazy Legs?
Oh, I keep forgetting who guy I'm thinking everybody knows who Crazy Legs. So Crazy
Maybe
Legs,
everybody does, but
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Crazy Legs is an original B-Boy from the 1970s New York movement. So they were the ones creating B-Boy. He's part of one of the master crews of b-boying called Rocksteady Crew. So Rocksteady Crew's famous. Crazy Leg is famous. He's still around. 100% Puerto Rican cat, the whole nine. We hired him, paid him some chump change, paid for his flight, and he slept at Breaker Ray's house. And he judged the battle for us. So, but when I first met him, I said, "Hey, man, I'm B-Boy B," and he just looked at me funny. He's like, "You can't use B-Boy. we're all b-boys. And I'm like, whatever. I let it go. And then a couple of years later, every break dancer coming up was calling themselves b-boy and then their name, like b-boy Juan, b-boy John. Everybody was now using the term b-boy as an identifier. So I was one of the first ones to use it. I can't tell you with exact certainty that I was the first one, but I know I was the first one in Chicago to use the term b-boy as an identifier of who I was, because that was my first craft. That was my first element. So that's how b-boy was scolded by a master of b-boying, saying I couldn't use it. And then it just engulfed the whole movement, and everybody is now called b-boy something. So he
Domino
couldn't stop
effect.
it. He couldn't stop it.
You couldn't.
No,
Oh, wow. So then you guys started taking this a little bit more serious,
yes,
organizing, and then you went to school. You studied, right? You went to Columbia, and
I did.
you.
Yes.
How did you evolve, or how did you take this history, of everything that you had done and into your education?
So I I went to Lane Tech, which back in the '80s was one of the b-boy schools, the hip hop schools, where there was a lot of b-boys that went there. Trickster went there, and Devsky went there, Scarce, a bunch of car crew guys, a bunch of writers from the north side went to Lane Tech. And I would go there from Logan Square. I would travel there. It was a magnet school. And that's where we kind of met other people from other parts of the city, because Lane Tech was a magnet school. It had people from all over, like way from the south side, whatever. So I met a lot of b-boys and a lot of breakers and a lot of writers there. And traveling, you would go to other schools that were also hip hop schools, like Von Steuben was a hip hop school. Steinmetz had some writers. So Schurz had a bunch of like hip hop heads. So all these schools kind of got together, and they kind of like formed a little network, and then that's how we started doing parties. And then after high school, so as my life is progressing, hip hop is also progressing, right? So hip hop, when it first started, was childish, right? Hip hop, hip it to the hip hop, right? So it sounded like it sounded childish. But as the skills developed, the verbal skills developed, the writing skills developed, and the b-boy skills developed, like in the early 2000s they were doing some amazing like b-boy things that I can't do right now. That's like I used to call it an upside down ballet, because these cats were doing these aerial things that were like that defied gravity. They were doing crazy like tracks, and I was like, wow, like that's light years ahead of what I was doing in the '80s. Same thing with graph. It just progresses. So as I'm growing, as all the people that I knew in the '80s were growing, so was our culture. And in the '80s, that culture had zero adults. Like if you saw an adult, you'd run away, right? Today, you have grandfathers, grandmothers as part of the culture of hip hop. But back then, there was no adults. They did not understand they didn't want to know what we were doing. Like, what are you doing? Stop, get off the floor. So it's different today, because we grew up as hip hoppers. And as we grew up, hip hop grew up like all over the world. And part of that was, becoming more educated. I went to Columbia College. I started the Fly Paper when I was at Columbia College. So the Fly Paper was the Chicago's longest running underground hip hop newspaper. We reported on everything that Word Up magazine didn't do, Source magazine didn't do. All they talked about is East Coast and West Coast, but nobody talked about anything that was coming from Chicago. So we created the Fly Paper.
What year was
So
this?
The flypaper was created in 1991.
91. And how long did the paper run?
So the paper ran for 19 years, but there was a couple of gaps in between. So it ran for 4 years the first time, and then we took a gap about 3 or 4 years in between because the flypaper started with Mike Shane, Raymond O'Neill, and myself. Then Raymond O'Neill got a job in New York working for one of those large magazines, the hip hop magazines. So they plucked him from us, and he moved to New York. And then the flypaper fell apart for a little bit. But then everywhere I went, yo, B, when you gonna put a flypaper out? When you gonna put a flypaper out? I got tired of people asking me when am I gonna put a flypaper out. So I just started doing it again. And then I did it for like 11 straight years. Then I took a break for 2 years, and then I did it for a few more years until 2008 when the market crashed, and everybody crashed because of 2008. And I don't know if you remember that, but in 2008 the market crashed and everybody went belly up. So that's the last time we printed the flypaper. But yeah, it was journalism. We covered Chicago people only. We covered Chicago graffiti only. It was very Chicago centric. And, we were the first, maybe not the first magazine, but we were definitely the longest lasting. We were set in stone. We were there like every month for years. And people waited for that thing to come out. And at the parties, we'd pass them out, and it was free. Everything I do was free. All my parties were free. We throw parties outside in the park for free. We gave away the flypaper for free. Everything we did was free. So for the culture. So that led me into journalism, photography, and archiving things and collecting things, which led the next step in growing up. Then you start doing gallery events, and so I started doing gallery events, and I did like a graffiti jean jacket shows, and then the last 5-7 years we've been doing old school shows like, hey, this is from 30 years ago, and that's called permanent record. So that's how we got into it, in the evolution of everything. As we grow up, hip hop grows up with us because we are making it grow up. So now when a young person is getting into hip hop and they're like 12 or 13, there is a culture with adults in it. As opposed to when we were doing hip hop, we didn't even know it was called hip hop. We were just like, oh man, I want to do graffiti. Oh, I want to break, and oh, I love that beat. And we listened to songs and we mimicked them. So we slowly built the culture in Chicago. Now it's built. And so, for instance, there's this kid that grew up with me. His name is DJ Nonstop. He became DMX's road DJ. So he's from Chicago. He's from Logan Square. His name is Nonstop. He was part of ABC. His name was Gizmo when he tagged through it with ABC. His DJ name was DJ Nonstop. He's DMX's DJ. 20 years later, he's at the Battle for the Eagle. He's mixing for us. And there's a kid in the crowd breakdancing, and that little kid is named Nonstop. And he's a breaker. He's a little white kid, and he breaks. He's really good. He's so good that he's now part of the Brickheads. But they both met, and like, hey man, I'm Nonstop from the 1980s. Welcome to the culture. And he showed him his tattoo and everything. So, but DJ Nonstop is a DJ, and Nonstop is a breaker. With the Brickheads. But that goes to show you, they're literally 30 years apart at the same party at the Battle for the Eagle.
Beautiful. It's so
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah,
That's super,
yeah.
super cool. We are talking about an evolution. Oh, it's this link.
Yes.
An evolution. I mean, that alone, just what you shared, that story, that signifies so much. And that says so, so, so much. And even when you were mentioning about everything that we did, we give this back. We gave it, not
Yeah.
asking for anything. And when we're talking about the birth of these type of movements that are involved within hip hop, whether it be graffiti or emceeing or DJing or breakdancing, we get to this fifth element of unity and of love. And this movement is so special because it literally came from just being a kid, from just being a kid looking for a place to go with nowhere to
Yeah.
go or nowhere to be accepted, where you make your own place to be
Yeah.
accepted. And now it's like snowballed
Yes.
into an amazing place of acceptance and liberty and freedom and creative expression. And we have you in Chicago, you leaders and innovators that paved this movement. So when you see this now, like the story that you just shared, where you have, this huge generation that's been influenced right before your eyes, what is that like for you?
Oh, it's great. I mean, I love that, we're still active in the culture as adults. We're still active in the culture as grandparents,
And mentors?
mentors, and teaching that history to these younger kids, so they have, some ancestry attached, so they have like a feel like they're part of something that's way bigger than what they're like doing now, and the teaching and the knowledge that, like, the fifth element of the last, of the four elements, the last one is like teaching and giving back, right? So as graffiti writers, uh you would hand down your styles, and you would teach the next generation, right? So ABC had spawned a couple of different younger crews, right? Like Mars crew, and that was like a younger crew that, if you got good enough, then you would become ABC. Um, but that tradition, like of apprenticeship, of handing down the things that we learned, like, hey man, when I first put spray paint on a wall, I sprayed the wall, a brick wall, and it soaked in, and it looked like it had been there for 20 years. But now I know better. Like, you have to ice the wall first and then put paint on it, and then it becomes more vibrant. So that knowledge is handed down to the next generation because of the mistakes that we made, you know? So that's what you keep doing. You keep teaching these next kids the knowledge, the fifth element, how to break, how to do graph, how to DJ. It's very, intricate. You teach them linguistics, and then how to rap. And so this is now become a full-fledged culture that is never going to go away. Now, like they said in the early 80s, like, it's just a fad. It's not a fad. It's still here. And it makes me feel, like, awesome to be still a part of it.
Yes,
So,
hip hop is definitely a way of life, and it is a very healthy and encouraging way of life that is still helping children and adults today. As B-Boy B mentioned, how it united completely different generations that could have been completely different backgrounds, cultures, social classes. And that's what I feel is the beauty of what hip hop does. It brings down all of those walls, and all
yeah,
there is left is room for creativity and sharing the knowledge. Now, if we take a look at all art forms, I want to say all art forms, and I'm ignorant, to a lot of things because I don't know everything, like all of us, right? We're all
yeah,
ignorant
exactly.
to some to
Right.
some point.
Yep.
But I can tell you that there is no other art form that is so generous. There is no other art form that you have a sculpting teacher that is going to say, "Oh, here, this is how you do it." That doesn't
Right.
exist. It just doesn't. Um, this is in a very organic way of doing things, and I'm not saying that sculptors are bad people. I mean, I sculpt too, but I'm saying of the way that the streets get together, just so
Yeah.
grassroots.
Yes.
You go
Yes.
to a place and you could have a conversation. We had Tracy from Any Squared Space,
Yes.
in Logan Square, and she's doing so many amazing things for the community. Here,
Yes.
come together. We will teach you, and this is something that this
Yeah.
this
Wednesday nights. Yeah.
this culture does, and that's it's a beautiful thing. It's beyond it looking, authentically pleasing or authentically pleasing, what the
Yeah.
word
Yeah.
is, but it really builds community, and that's really important. So for the evolution of Chicago style graffiti, we are presenting to you more writers like B-Boy B that have paved the way for this generation and all of the generations to come. As we had mentioned with Trickster when he was on our show, and he dedicated an entire season to showing how graffiti influences every single part of our lives, whether we know it or not. So that's also very special. And we look forward to learning more about the rest of our writers and more about B-Boy B. Um, and this upcoming show with the Epiphany Center here in Chicago, which is another center that is also opening its doors to help the community and bring our community together here in Chicago. And B-Boy B, is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Man, I have like tons to share, but I'm good for now.
If there's
This
anything
is
that you
great.
feel is important, to the evolution or to your history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was one of the early pioneers. I know there's a lot of pioneers, but I came up in an era where there was no books, no photographs, no internet, and I you were forced to develop styles based on something you might have seen for about 2 seconds, and that includes a b-boy move, a breakdance move, or it includes a seeing a train pass by and it's over. Like you have to remember that, and now you got to try and not only mimic it but make it better, right? Because that's what it's really about. You take something, you remix it, and it's better now. So that's what the culture is about. And every time it gets remixed, it evolves into something better. So a lot of old school writers are like, way ahead of me, you know, but I didn't have anybody to look at in Chicago, and I know a lot of people think that, oh well, you weren't around during the heyday, because I was kind of like I'm a little older than everybody, so my heyday was like 82, 83, 84. I'm starting to like peak, and then in 85 I was like kind of slightly retired, because now I'm like 17, 18. I've been doing it for 4 years or so, and I have to retire because I don't want to get arrested. Plus, I'm having a kid. I'm having a kid now, which is crazy because kids having kids, but that's hood life, right? So I kind of like fell off for a little bit, like the 86, 87s, when like things were like really heightened, But I stuck around, and I'm still in the culture, but I just wasn't doing like the hardcore graph anymore. I was still breaking, but I wasn't like battling anymore, because the stuff that they were doing, was like, whoa, you're doing like some crazy airwave things, and you're flipping all over. I'm like, man, I can't do that. So you hip hop, with certain things, you have to kind of retire at a certain age, because getting too old to roll around on the floor. But I have to give it to some guys. They still can break at age 30, 35. Waka from the Brickheads, that dude's like well into his 30s, and that dude breaks like a 15-year-old. He's twice everybody's age, and he can still get down and win battles. And there's some writers out here that still like get up, like, yeah, and they're in their 40s, and they're still doing it. But sometimes life happens. But I did other things. I gathered information. I made safe spaces for the culture. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm glad that it keeps going, no matter what we do or when we retire. I think the teach one, teach the next will keep this culture going.
Absolutely. It's interesting talking with some of the older graffiti writers. Some will say graffiti's dead, graffiti died in the 90s, and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
there's some that will say like graffiti will always evolve. So it's always a very interesting perspective for the innovators that are watching it turn into like, what is this? This is mishmash. Like what we did was
yeah,
real was real
Yeah.
graffiti. So that's very interesting. And we thank you again so much for being with us and for giving us this opportunity to share this very important culture here in Chicago. It's such an honor. So thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. And thank you, Can TV, for allowing this platform as well and the Epiphany Center for the partnership. We so look forward and to seeing you guest at the show. And if you got some moves, some breakdancing moves, make sure you bring them through because we are going to be competing. And B-Boy B will be judging and we will have tons of fun. We have a lot more to look forward to for this entire season, all the way through the fall and through the opening of the show. We so look forward. Thank you. Thank
Cool.
you for being with us, and we'll see you again next week.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.